Dan Lanning's vision for a football roster is starting to materialize with their latest commitment, but he still needs to keep recruiting hard. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe wherever you listen to or watch this show, which now features the Duck. For those of you on podcast, I got a couple Christmas gifts in the mail. You may have noticed. Throw a pillow and a blanket over there. Pillow with the Duck's face on it over there. You may know him as Puddles. If you don't like it, you're probably not a Duck fan. So, anyway, I think Dan Lanning's vision for Oregon football with this Ashton Porter commitment continues to be clear. He wants things to start on the defensive line. Not just the defensive side of the ball, but on the defensive line. Oregon's list of 2023 commitments continues to grow, and I will talk about Porter a bit later, but I want to start big picture here. As a defensive coach, Dan Lanning wants that to be at least not a weakness, certainly, but you imagine he would like it to be at some level kind of the identity of this Oregon team or be an unquestioned strength of this Ducks team. There has never been, nor will there ever be, a good or great defense that doesn't have a good or great defensive line. You cannot only get pressure by blitzing. You have to be able to be disruptive in the trenches with the front four. And all of these guys who have committed to the Ducks now, and fear not, Duck fans, Ashton Porter did sign with the Ducks. That is official. He put pen to paper on the NLI, no Peyton Bowen situation there. But all of these guys are not going to play. Some of them will. We all know in the transfer portal era, some may leave after a year, some may leave after 2, some may leave after 3, some may never leave at all, some may become studs, but we don't know. And recruiting, even when you do it at a high level, there is an element of playing craps, which is what craps sounds like for those of you who don't know. It doesn't actually, but it's rolling the dice. It's rolling the dice, and the hit rate, even on highly rated recruits, it's not 100%. I think we know that by now. At any given position, someone is not going to live up to their full potential that gets them a 4 or 5 star rating. It just doesn't happen 100% of the time, and we know that. And sometimes a 3-star guy pops and plays like a 4 or 5 star player. And sometimes it goes in the other direction. Sometimes they're somewhere in the middle. Sometimes they're just the player you expected them to be. Sometimes Eric Armstead comes in as a 5-star defensive tackle, and he was kind of a monster, the entire time and led the defense that got the Ducks to the national championship game. Sometimes they are like that. So, again, talking about Porter later, but the number of commitments that have come on the defensive line, whether it's interior defensive linemen or edge players, is making it very clear that Dan Lanning and his staff identified that as a weakness. I don't even think as the season went on. I think they knew what needed to happen from a personnel standpoint before the season even began. Because think about what it takes to get a recruit to commit to your school. Well, except for, apparently, the Dante Moore situation, it takes more than just a couple weeks. You got to have first contact. You got to go out to see him. You got to have him on campus. All that sort of stuff. So the fact that there's such a high volume of players in the trenches on the defensive side of the ball is reflective of our head coach and is also reflective of what he's trying to establish and what he thinks needs to improve the most going into next year and in the future. And I think he's setting Oregon up very well for that. He is getting a lot of 4 and occasionally 5-star talent, one of whom I'll talk about tomorrow potentially in Nicole's Harbor. We'll have John back on the show talking Cruton, but there are a lot of players in there who you could look at and say, that guy might be just okay, but that guy could be really good, or that guy could be good, that guy could be good, and you never know who's going to pop. You never know who's going to overperform. You never know who's going to underperform. And there's so many players in this class. There's a huge, huge number of players in this class for Oregon, and it could still continue to grow. I don't know what the exact scholarship numbers are right now, but I imagine they could need some players to continue to leave, and they probably will at some point in time. And you got Popo coming back. That's not a recruit per se, but kind of feels like a transfer portal addition almost, because he's an instant impact guy who wasn't on the team this year, save for a little bit in the Georgia game. I lead all this into a mailbag question, of which we've got a couple here on the show, which I always appreciate. YouTube comments, Twitter, whatever. Slide in the DMs, go in the comments, ask a question. You know the handles by now. My guy Nick P on YouTube asks, here's a question. Indeed it is. All season we have heard your show and others say that we just need to wait till Dan gets his guys, quote unquote. Just around the his, not the guys. Have seen enough of, quote, his type of guys. I think he means to say, have you seen enough of his type of guys that will make a noticeable impact towards showing what Dan brought from Georgia? And this speaks to the mindset I think that a lot of us have with Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy, which is between Lanning's schematic and recruiting chops, and Tosh Lupoy, who I saw the other day on 24/7 is rated as one of the 25 best recruiters in the country. You should be able to bring in a lot of high-level players who can make the defense maybe not like Georgia's, but be made in that same mold, in that same sort of vision. And the question about whether or not we've seen enough of those guys to this point in time to build that sort of defense, I don't think it's going to be there, at its best in 2023. But by 2024, I do expect Dan Lanning and the staff to have Oregon's defense as one of the three best in the conference. And if they don't, it'd be a disappointment. Because when you bring in all these highly rated recruits, right? A lot of four-star guys, Ashton Porter, Terrence Green, Amari Washington, right? Keep going up and down the list, and a couple of promising three-stars. I kind of like Jaden Moore out of the state of California, I'm pretty sure. A three-star to watch. Tavita Pomei, he's just a huge body. He's like 6'6", 340, big guy. Jordan Scott style. Maybe he'll be a run stuffer in the middle of that defense one day. A lot of guys who have that sort of potential and who make you say, hey, is that going to be a game-changing player, or is that guy going to be a regular rotation? How much is he going to play, right? But at this point in time, I don't know if you can definitively say, well, he's got all the guys because he's brought in all these recruits. Even when you bring in a really good recruiting class, most are not going to be ready to make a big impact as a true freshman. There are a select few who can, and we've seen that over the years, right? But even think about a guy like Troy Franklin, and that's on the offensive side of the ball, but I'm just taking an example. He was a high four-star recruit. Last year, offensive scheme certainly played a part of this. He had an impact, but it wasn't a huge major impact. But then in year two, he pops. And that's part of the transition, getting in the weight room, meal plan, adjusting to the college schedule, which is an absolute grind for student athletes. All of that sort of stuff. But I don't think Lanning's got all of the pieces even set up for the future that he necessarily needs, or that we know of at this point in time. I will tell you why after I tell you about my friends at BetOnline, your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season to basketball and the World Cup. We've got it all at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting information. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, I don't think Oregon's defense is all the way there. Now, there could be enough players in this class that we look back in 2024, which is a long ways away for sure, but Rome was not built in a day. I think Lanning and staff came in this year and worked with what they had, which was still plenty of talent, but maybe not their type of talent, right? And now that quote that Nick is talking about in the question saying, is Lanning going to be able to get his guys, right? The sorts of players that fit his scheme and what they want to do and how they fit in. There aren't going to be any excuses for that going forward, including this season. But still, I expect Oregon's defense to be at its best, or maybe, go to new heights, take that next step by 2024. In 2023, yeah, they should take a step forward because it was not very good this year. But the reason that I don't think it's, all going to fall into place in 2023 is when you look at that Georgia defense and how great it was, right? None of us are expecting that Oregon's going to be able to build a defense of that exact caliber, right? Because I don't know that we'll ever see a defense of that caliber. They allowed like 11 points per game, 10 points per game, or some obscene number, okay? Absolutely ridiculous. Led them to the national championship game. But we can expect and should expect that the defense becomes one of the best in the conference. But when you look at what made that Georgia defense so great, yes, Lanning was the play caller. They'd recruited a lot of high-level players, but they had elite guys at every level. And when you think of the best Oregon defenses, they had elite guys at every level, more than one. You can't have just one in a position group and say, well, yeah, that group is good enough. No, you need to have a lot of good players. Like, think about the last great defense Oregon had, 2019. Pac-12 and Rose Bowl champs with Justin Herbert at quarterback. Probably left a lot on the table offensively, but that was kind of a defensively led team. That defense was ridiculous. They allowed like 19 points per game. They were really, really good. They had Kayvon Thibodeau on that defensive line. Yeah, that's probably the best edge player Oregon will, I don't know, maybe ever see come through the program. We'll see what Mateo does, but I don't think anybody can match up to Kayvon Thibodeau. He was the number one recruit in the country for a reason. Then you look at the second level of that defense. They had some pretty darn solid linebackers. I don't think it was anything amazing. Isaac Slade-Matoatia was in there. I'm trying to remember who the other linebacker was. But their linebackers were solid. But then you look at the secondary. Go look at that secondary and what they had and where those guys are now. Verone McKinley was a true freshman. He's playing in the NFL. Went undrafted, somehow, some way, he's in the NFL. Javon Holland is a starter in the NFL and was a pretty high-round draft pick. Diamador Lenore is a starter on one of the best defenses in the NFL. Thomas Graham is an NFL-caliber player who started, I think, for a little while with the Bears and is now more of a dime guy. Mikhail Wright was a true freshman, grew into an all Pac-12 caliber player. Really, really good in college. So you have to have those guys at every level. You have to have a really good player. I think linebacker is arguably the least important because it's such a pass-happy game of football nowadays. But when I look at what Dan Lanning is doing here, and the point I made at the beginning of the show, he's bringing in a lot of defensive linemen. I'm sure these coaches know not all these guys are going to pop and become great, amazing players, but they need to find the 2 or 3 who are going to become good to great players on the defense and then continue to build. And I think you can, nowadays find good enough linebackers. Even think of Oregon's national championship defense, the team that played Ohio State. You had 2 elite top 10 picks in the defensive line in Buckner and Armstead. Then you had solid linebackers. Joe Walker ended up playing in the NFL for a little while. He was pretty darn good. And then on the back end, you had Troy Hill and Efo. And Reggie Daniels was a good player. And Eric Dargan was a good player. But you had Troy Hill and Efo, and those are 2 NFL caliber corners, right? So when I look at what Dan Lanning is trying to do here and the guys he's bringing in and the guys who project as players going forward, I think the defensive line is, at this point in time, got the most potential to have young players really start to make an impact and become good because there's so many guys in this class. But then as you move back on the defense, a lot more questions, right? I've liked what I've seen from Triquez Bridges. Is he going to take a jump to be an elite corner next year? Is Dante Manning and Jaleel Florence and that cadre of guys, Dalen Austin, Kyrie Jackson, right? Dalen Austin, the true freshman who will come in this 2023 cycle. Kyrie Jackson, the Alabama transfer. Are those guys going to be good enough to take the defense to where it needs to be? Because your schematics can be as good as you want. If you don't have guys who at some point can win one-on-one matchups, especially on the defensive line and in the secondary, your defense can only go so far. So that's an important thing to consider. And do I think this recruiting class is looking like a great step forward towards getting to that point for Lanning and Lupoy? Yes, I do. Because they're looking at the defensive line, a huge weakness, not just from a numbers, but from a talent standpoint, and saying we need more high quality players here now and in the future, and it has to be our foundation. But as you look towards the back end of that defense, there's still some questions, right? And the prospects of a Cody DeCamara or a Tyler Turner or J.J. Greenfield, Trajan Williams, becoming more involved and becoming better players at the safety position going forward, sure, it's encouraging. But you can't have guys who are okay. You can't have guys who are average. You need to have a lot. You got to have really at least four. You got to have at least 4 or 5 NFL caliber players. They don't all have to be first round picks like Georgia, right? That's not a realistic standard. But between the defensive line, the secondary, and the linebackers, you've got to have at least 4 NFL caliber guys who are plug and play starters in the league and are good enough to be at that level. That's what you need to build a championship caliber defense. And I don't think Oregon is there yet, but I do think amongst all these 4-star defensive linemen, odds are you're going to be able to find a couple who can be really good players and be the sorts of guys that we need them to be. So I hope that answers your question, but it is definitely a process. And, though there was a lot of highly rated talent on this team when Lanning and company got here, it is worth noting that a lot of the same issues that plagued the defense this year plagued them last year as well. And that's with a different play caller and a different scheme and different approach. And maybe guys are taking time to learn it. And that's just, part of how this all goes, because it does take time to fully understand your assignments and where you go and playing aggressive, trusting the system and all that sort of stuff. But I don't expect this thing defensively to be fully ready in 2023, though I do expect a step forward. And then as the years continue to go on, that's when we continue to evaluate, okay, which guys can become high-level instant impact players. And it doesn't matter with the transfer portal, too. It does matter. I didn't pronunciate very well there. Or enunciate there very well. But it does matter with the transfer portal, too, the guys you bring in sort of impact that they can have. So, great question, Nick. Always love your questions. Got this one, too, from Joe Tully. Watching the last major bowl games this year, ... That's 6 dots in there, for those of you who are wondering. Most of you probably weren't, but, I like to keep you on your toes anyway. How's our kicking game looking? First of all, good question. Great question to ask. I just love how it was set up. Watching the last major bowl games this year, I assume he's thinking like I'm watching what other teams do with punting and kickoffs and coverage and all that sort of stuff, and saying, how's our kicking game looking? Great question. So, Oregon has signed a punter in this cycle from Australia who we know basically nothing about. His name is Luke Dune, or Dunn, D-U-N-N-E. Australian guys have had a history of success in college football, so maybe that's encouraging. They cycled through a number of punters this year, and special teams are definitely an area where Oregon's got to improve. Outside of Camden Lewis, who was honorable mention this year. I think he was second team Pac-12 a year ago. I feel great about him. I really do. And gosh, I will repeat that kid's story as many times as I can here on the show, because let's be blunt. He was bad as a freshman. He lost his job. He lost his kicking job, and then he won it back, and then in the process earned our trust to the point where if it's inside of 45 yards, I'm not hoping he makes it. I expect him to make it. That's a heck of a radical change. That is a heck of a radical change. But the rest of the question here, I could probably spend a while talking about this, but outside of Camden Lewis, I think just about everything should be open in terms of competition for the Ducks on special teams, because the kickoff coverage was not great this year. I think Boyle did a pretty good job generating touchbacks, but when he didn't, went out of bounds a few more times than you would like. That puts the defense in a bad situation. And really the kicking game on coverage is more about the other 10 guys other than just the kicker. But if you can just get a touchback, that's really good. But every time Oregon didn't have a touchback this year, felt like the other team was starting beyond the 30-yard line. Way, way too often. And they didn't statistically put up great special teams numbers this year. So I think that's pretty easily a place where they can improve. Their punting can get way better. I mean, how many times did Oregon flip the field this year? And that was something that did come into play in a rather important game in 2021. Remember the Ohio State game? You know, I had a couple of kick-ass punts. Pretty sure it was Tom Snee. And that helped Oregon win the game. And if you're going to build all this talk about defense and when can they be ready and when are they going to get his guys, you can't have a great defense if your special teams aren't at least good. They don't need to be average. They need to be good. Because a defense has an advantageous situation when the other team is backed up inside their own 10-yard line. How many times did Oregon have the other team backed up inside their 10 this year? I remember one time against Washington because we got cute and fumbled on the 1-yard line. That was infuriating. But what happened in that sequence? Washington had to be a little more conservative. Ducks made a stop. I think Mace Funa had a big tackle on 3rd down. Forced a 3-and-out. Short field for the offense. Went down, scored a touchdown. Okay, that sequence of events did not happen a lot this year. I think punters should be wide open. If this Dune or Dunn guy comes in from Australia and he's the best punter, put him in right now. Nothing about what the punting situation showed this year indicated that any guy's job should be safe. And that goes for, I think we had just the one punt blocked, but punt coverage, kickoff coverage, nothing about that instills me with a lot of confidence right now. It's just Camden Lewis and kind of Andrew Boyle on kickoffs. Kind of. Because I thought he was, for the most part, I'd give him a solid B- this year. I'm a tough grader, but I'd give Boyle a B- in that department. You can get better. You could do a lot worse because I think he had a pretty solid touchback percentage this year. But everything else can pretty much improve. And I think, to what I believe was Joe's point here in framing this question, when you watch other teams play and you watch the other good teams play, especially in these big-time bowl games like Joe clearly was, you see the difference and how often a team has a really good punt with great coverage or has a kickoff that they tackle the guy inside the 20. I don't know if Oregon did that this year, where a ball was fielded and returned, and we tackled him inside the 20. I really don't know. The best situation this year on kickoffs for Oregon were touchbacks. And that's not always what you want to have. Because as we know, right, remember the Oregon State game, Chris Hudson makes a blunder inside the 5-yard line, and what do you know? The offense is way backed up. They end up going 3-and-out, drop a punt, don't need to go back down that infuriating rabbit hole. But you remove the potential for those successful plays and situations when you can't execute on special teams the way you need to. It's definitely something Oregon needs to work on this year. Tez Johnson, who I talked about yesterday, and I'm going to close with just some initial thoughts on Ashton Porter here in a sec. One thought that someone, I think a couple of you actually asked me the question. One of you, Dave on Twitter, sent me a message and said, could Tez Johnson be a kick returner? That could make a lot of sense. That could make a lot of sense because when he transferred in, I had my full thoughts on yesterday's show. Basically, my takeaway was, well, I'm not sure how much he's going to be able to play at wide receiver. And maybe he just wants to come and be in the same place as Bo Nix, his adopted brother, play on the same football team, fulfill that dream. That's totally possible, seeing as how Bo has just 1 year of eligibility remaining and Tez has got 2. It could also be, because Tez was Troy's leading receiver this year, that part of the reason he was willing to come over and compete for the wide receiver position is because he looks at the kick return situation and says, well, I could maybe see the field there. Because he's smaller, he's got good speed, he's a good athlete, small, but DeAnthony Thomas was small. So if you're a good enough athlete to just run away and not get hit that much, then, whatever floats your boat. I think that could be a possibility. I think that could be a possibility. I don't think he returned kicks this year for the Trojans, but let's see. Yeah, doesn't look like he was a returner. He had a few. Looks like he had a couple punt returns. He had 6 punt returns on the season, no kick returns listed. So that's a possibility because that punt return and kick return's kind of been a revolving door for the Ducks. They haven't had a great kick returner since like Charles Nelson, pretty much. So I think that's definitely a possibility. And he does fit the sort of body type that could compete for that. Oregon got a commit in Ashton Porter, who we'll be talking about at length on tomorrow's show with my guy John Garcia, a recruiting insider here at the network. One of you asked me on Twitter, I'm sorry, I forgot who it was and I didn't write it down, but you know who you are, whether he would play tight end or defensive line. He's listed as a defensive lineman, has the body type of an edge prospect. I think there was some chatter about which side of the ball he could play. I would lean towards defensive line for all the reasons I laid out over the course of this show. But here's what I'll say about the prospect of him playing tight end. We did just lose Maliki Matavao to the portal. Kenyon Sadiq, little more of a wide receiver type, right? He fits that mold of a receiving tight end more than a balanced guy, and Matavao was kind of block first, catch second, but I thought showed a lot of potential in the pass catching sense. I imagine he will play defensive line. There's a better opportunity for him to play early in his career there than at tight end. However, if Cam McCormick decides that he's done with football, we don't know at this point in time. If Cam McCormick decides, no, my football career is over, then I'd almost want him to play tight end because you'd have T. Ferg, of course, Patrick Herbert, nothing, right? And Matavao played as a true freshman. T. Ferg played as a true freshman. Tight end, one of those positions you can be plug and play pretty easily. Receivers that way as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. We'll just kind of see how that all shakes out. Appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening, and go Ducks.